"She's deaf! Take her!" drunk father shouted, until a mountain man whispered, "I know you can hear me." The heat in the Redemption Saloon was a physical weight, thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and the cheap perfume clinging to the painted doves. It pressed down on Anway, a suffocating blanket she had learned to wear like a second skin. She kept her eyes on the scarred floorboards, a universe of scuffs and stains, letting the noise of the room wash over her, a meaningless roar of laughter, clinking glass, and coarse shouts. Her father, Lau, stood beside her, his hand a claw on her arm. His breath was sour with whiskey. He was building to his moment, the way a summer storm gathers on the plains, all dark cloud and muttering thunder before the inevitable break. Anway braced herself. She had been through this before, in other towns, other grimy rooms. The performance was always the same. "A good girl," Lau slurred, his voice loud enough to cut through the din. "Strong. A hard worker." A few men at the bar turned, their eyes oily with appraisal. They saw her dark red prairie dress, the only decent thing she owned, and the fall of black hair that hid her face. They saw a piece of property. "She don't speak. Don't hear a thing." Lau tapped his own temple. "Empty up here. But her hands are good. Cook, clean. Take her. A few dollars. She's yours." A ripple of cruel laughter went through the room. A man with a stained vest spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "What use is a deaf Chinese girl?" Anway did not flinch. She was a stone. She was a post. She was nothing. Then the room changed. The noise did not stop, but a pocket of silence formed around a man who had been sitting in the corner, a man so large he seemed to have been carved from the mountain rock itself. He rose slowly, unfolding to a height that made the other patrons seem small and loud. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, and his hair was long, tied back with a leather thong. His eyes, fixed on her father, were the color of a winter sky. He moved without a sound, his worn buckskins making no rustle, his boots heavy but silent on the boards. He stopped before them, a wall of muscle and quiet menace. He looked past Lau, his gaze settling on Anway. For a second she felt seen, truly seen, and a tremor of fear, sharp and unfamiliar, went through her. "Leave the girl alone," the mountain man said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. Lau, emboldened by drink, puffed out his chest. "This is my daughter, my business." The big man didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I'm making it mine." He reached into a pouch on his belt and dropped 2 heavy silver dollars on the bar. They landed with a solid, final clink. "That's for your whiskey. Now get out." Lau looked from the coins to the man, and the drunken courage shriveled inside him. He snatched the silver, let go of Anway's arm, and scuttled away like a rat, disappearing into the blinding glare of the street. The man turned his gaze back to Anway. The saloon held its breath. He gestured to the door. "Come on." It was not a request. The journey from the town of Redemption was a silent one. The mountain man, whose name she did not know, had bought a sturdy pack mule and a few supplies with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a life lived without wasted motion. He loaded the mule, then turned to her. He simply cupped a hand for her foot and lifted her onto the broad back of his own horse, a formidable gray destrier that watched the world with intelligent, calm eyes. He settled in front of her, a solid, warm presence that blocked the sun. Anway kept herself rigid, her hands gripping the back of his saddle, careful not to touch him. The heat of the day was relentless, beating down on the dusty trail that led away from the ramshackle town and up into the foothills. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with pine and dry earth. She watched the landscape change, the flat, sun-baked plains giving way to rolling hills, and then to the jagged blue-green shadows of the mountains. They rode for hours. He never spoke, never looked back, but she felt his awareness of her in the steady rhythm of his breathing, in the way he shifted his weight to ease the horse on a steep incline. She was a parcel he was transporting, a responsibility he had inexplicably taken on. She had perfected the art of being invisible, of making herself small and unthreatening. Her deafness was a shield, a lie that had kept her alive for 6 months of running. It made men dismiss her, overlook her, or pity her. All were preferable to being noticed. But this man, he did not seem to be the kind of man who overlooked anything. His silence was different from hers. Hers was a performance, a frantic hiding place. His was a state of being, as natural as the granite cliffs they were now riding between. It was a silence that listened. As the sun began to dip below the peaks, casting long, cool shadows across the trail, he finally reined in the horse. They were in a small sheltered meadow, a stream cutting through it like a silver ribbon. The air was cool and alive. He slid from the horse and turned, his hands reaching up to help her down. His grip was firm around her waist, easily lifting her to the ground. She stood before him, keeping her eyes lowered, waiting for a sign, a gesture, a command. He studied her face in the fading light, his expression unreadable beneath the beard. She felt a prickle of unease. He was too close, too large. The quiet of the mountains was more intimidating than the noise of the saloon. They made camp by the stream. He moved with a familiar economy, starting a small, smokeless fire, unsaddling the horse and rubbing it down with a practiced hand. He offered her a piece of hardtack and a strip of dried jerky, which she accepted with a nod of her head, the practiced gesture of a grateful mute. She sat by the fire, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. The stars began to appear, impossibly bright in the black sky. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the gentle murmur of the stream, and the soft munching of the horse and mule grazing nearby. It was a peacefulness so profound it felt dangerous. Peace was a luxury she could not afford. It made you soft, made you forget the hunters on your trail. The mountain man sat across the fire from her, sharpening a large knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was a steady, hypnotic sound. He did not look at her, yet she felt pinned by his presence. He had bought her, in a way. What did he expect in return? The question was a cold stone in her stomach. After a long while, he stopped sharpening the knife. He tested the edge with his thumb, then slid it back into its sheath on his belt. The sudden silence was jarring. He looked at her then, his eyes catching the firelight. They were clear and direct, holding no malice, but no pity either. They held a terrifying perception. He leaned forward slightly, his voice a low whisper that the fire seemed to absorb, a sound meant only for her, a sound that sliced through her carefully constructed world. "I know you can hear me." Anwe froze. Every muscle in her body went rigid. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin cold. She did not look up. She did not breathe. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with absolute certainty. The shield she had hidden behind for so long had just been shattered with 5 quiet words. She was exposed, vulnerable, in the middle of an immense wilderness with a man who saw right through her. Panic, cold and sharp, coiled in her gut. She had to run. But where? The mountains stretched in every direction, an unforgiving and unknown territory. He was her only guide, and he had just become her greatest threat. He said nothing more, simply rose and laid out a bedroll for her near the fire, then took his own and settled a short distance away, his back against a rock, his rifle resting beside him. He was giving her space, but it was the space a wolf gives a cornered rabbit. The next day's travel was freighted with a new, unbearable tension. Finn, he had told her his name was Finn that morning, a simple offering into the charged silence, did not press her. He acted as if his revelation by the fire had never happened. He treated her with the same quiet, practical consideration as before, helping her onto the horse, handing her water from his canteen. But the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Anwe could no longer hide in the comfortable shell of her feigned disability. Every sound was now a test. The call of a hawk overhead, the snap of a twig under the horse's hoof, the quiet clearing of his throat. She had to consciously stop herself from reacting. She felt his eyes on her, not constantly, but in brief, assessing glances. He was watching, waiting. Her mind raced, trying to understand his motives. Why reveal his knowledge? Why not use it against her? He had saved her from one kind of predator in the saloon, but what if he was just another kind, more patient, more clever? As they climbed higher, the air grew crisp and the trail narrowed. They navigated switchbacks cut into the mountainside, with sheer drops to one side that made her stomach clench. Finn guided the horse with a steady, confident hand, his large frame a solid shield against the dizzying emptiness. Late in the afternoon, they crested a ridge, and he pulled the horse to a halt. Below them, nestled in a high valley, was a cabin. It was not a ramshackle hut, but a sturdy, defiant structure of thick, squared-off logs and stone, with a low-pitched roof and a wide porch. A plume of smoke curled from a stone chimney, a sign of life in the vast emptiness. A small, fenced garden lay to one side, and a well-built corral held a second horse. It was a place built to last, a fortress against the wilderness. "We're home," he said, his voice quiet. He dismounted and helped her down. As her feet touched the ground, she looked at the cabin, at the soaring peaks that surrounded it like silent guardians. It was the most isolated and the most protected place she had ever seen. He led the horses to the corral, leaving her standing alone in the yard. She clutched the worn fabric of her red dress, a speck of color against the immense green and gray of the mountain. For the first time in months, she was not in a crowded, dirty town. For the first time, there was nowhere to run. The front door of the cabin opened, and he stood there, silhouetted against the dim interior. "You can have the loft room. It's warm." He stepped aside, holding the door open. It was an invitation into his world, a world where her lies were useless. With a deep, shaky breath, she walked past him and into the house. The cabin was one large room, dominated by a massive stone hearth. It was meticulously clean and ordered. Tools hung from pegs on the walls. Shelves were neatly stacked with supplies, and a heavy wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. A ladder led up to a sleeping loft. The place smelled of wood smoke, pine, and leather. It was the scent of self-sufficiency. Finn gestured toward the ladder. "Up there." He did not follow her. Anwe climbed, her boots silent on the wooden rungs. The loft was small but cozy, containing a simple bed with a thick wool blanket and a small high window that looked out over the valley. A sense of profound weariness washed over her, a bone-deep exhaustion from months of running, of pretending, of being afraid. She sank onto the edge of the bed. Down below, she could hear him moving about, the quiet sounds of a man at home in his space. He was making no demands, issuing no threats. He had stripped away her only defense and then offered her shelter. The contradiction was unnerving. She stayed in the loft until dusk fell, watching the light change on the mountain peaks. Finally, the smell of roasting meat pulled her back down the ladder. He had a small pot simmering over the fire and was turning 2 plump grouse on a spit. He glanced at her as she descended, then nodded toward the table. "Supper's near ready." They ate in silence. The grouse was savory and tender, and he had boiled some wild potatoes he must have dug from his garden. It was the best meal she'd had in a year. The silence was no longer a weapon between them. It had become a space, a territory they were cautiously learning to share. After they ate, he cleaned the plates with methodical care. He banked the fire for the night, the embers glowing like dormant eyes in the hearth. He still had not forced her to speak. He was giving her a choice, and the weight of that choice was immense. To speak was to surrender the last piece of her old life, the last strategy for survival. To remain silent was to continue a lie to a man who already knew the truth. She watched him check the locks on the heavy plank door and bar the window shutters, movements born of habit and caution. He was a man who understood threats. He looked out the small peephole in the door for a long moment, scanning the darkness, before he seemed satisfied. He turned, and his eyes met hers across the quiet room. "You're safe here," he said. It was a simple promise, but in the vast, dangerous world she inhabited, it was the most valuable thing anyone had ever offered her. The next days fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Anway did not speak, and Finn did not ask her to. She had decided that silence, for now, was still the safest path. Acknowledging his knowledge without surrendering her own voice felt like a small, necessary rebellion. She began to help with the chores, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. She fed the chickens he kept in a small coop, weeded the garden, and helped him haul water from the well. He accepted her help with a quiet nod. He taught her nothing with words, but she learned by watching. She learned how he could read the weather in the clouds, how he knew which plants were for eating and which for medicine, how he could move through the dense forest with the silence of a shadow. He was a part of the mountain, and it was a part of him. One afternoon, while she was mending a tear in his shirt, the fabric coarse and worn, the work of her needle precise and small, she saw them. 3 riders, far down the valley, moving slowly along the creek bed. They were just dark figures on horseback, but a cold dread seized her. They were too purposeful, their path leading directly toward the hidden valley. She dropped the shirt and ran to the door of the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. Finn was chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat in the afternoon quiet. She didn't shout. The habit of silence was too strong. She ran to him, grabbing his arm, her eyes wide with terror. He stopped, the axe held mid-swing, and looked down at her, his brow furrowed. She pointed frantically down the valley, her hands shaking. He followed her gaze. His body went still, but it was the stillness of a predator, every muscle tensed and ready. He stared for a long moment, his eyes narrowed. Then he looked at her, and his face was grim, hard as the granite peaks around them. He tossed the axe aside. "Inside. Now!" His voice was a low, urgent command that tolerated no argument. He pushed her toward the cabin, his hand on the small of her back. "Stay away from the window." Inside, he moved with lethal speed. He barred the door, then took his heavy rifle down from its pegs over the mantel. He checked the load, his movements economical and sure. He was no longer the quiet man who tended his garden. He was a warrior in his fortress. The transformation was swift and terrifying. He glanced at her, huddled near the hearth. "They're not local, not hunters." The riders disappeared into the trees at the base of the valley. They were out of sight, but their presence was a poison in the air. The peace of the mountain had been shattered. That night the cabin was a tinderbox of tension. The riders had not reappeared, but Finn knew it was a temporary reprieve. They were scouting, assessing. He sat at the table, methodically cleaning his rifle by the light of a single lantern, the soft clicks and scrapes of metal echoing in the small space. Anwe sat on a stool by the hearth, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The silence that had been a careful truce was now filled with unspoken questions and imminent danger. He did not look at her as he worked, his focus entirely on the weapon in his hands. "They're not looking for a man who lives alone," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. It was a piece of a puzzle he was fitting together. Anwe stared into the low flames of the fire, the heat warming her face, but not the ice in her veins. The time for lies was over. The danger he had invited into his home was her fault, and he deserved the truth. Her voice, when she finally used it, was rough from disuse, a quiet, hoarse whisper. "My name is Anwe." He paused in his work, but did not look up. He was listening. "My father was a foreman for the Union Pacific, for a man named Prescott." She took a shaky breath, the words feeling foreign and clumsy on her tongue. "Prescott. He cuts corners, uses stolen dynamite, cheap materials. Men get hurt. Men die. He lists them as deserters, hires new ones. My father knew. He kept a record." The whole story spilled out of her then, a torrent of fear and grief. How Prescott had discovered her father's ledger, how his men had come one night. She had been hiding, had heard the argument, the terrible final sound. She had grabbed the ledger and run, vanishing into the night. Her father had always told her, "Be invisible, be worthless. No one looks twice at a deaf Chinese girl." It had become her shield, her mantra. "The book. It has all of Prescott's crimes in it. The dates, the names of the dead, the money he stole. It's proof." Finn finished assembling the rifle and set it down gently on the table. He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Where is it?" he asked. Her hand went to the hem of her dark red dress. She had painstakingly unstitched the lining and sewn the thin leather-bound ledger inside it, its damning pages lying flat against the fabric. It had been with her this whole time. He nodded slowly, his gaze holding hers. "He'll never stop looking for you," he said. It was a grim prophecy, and they both knew it was true. "No," she whispered, her new voice trembling. "He won't." In that moment, the threat was no longer just hers. It was theirs. The attack came just before dawn. A single gunshot shattered the morning stillness, punching a hole through one of the thick wooden shutters. Splinters flew into the room. Finn was already moving, pulling Anwe from the loft ladder and shoving her toward the stone hearth. "Stay down!" he roared, the sound filling the small cabin. He was at the wall, peering through a small, carved peephole, his rifle already at his shoulder. Another shot slammed into the door, the impact shuddering through the entire structure. They were surrounded. The quiet valley had become a killing ground. "How many?" Anwe asked, her voice tight with fear. "4 that I can see," he grunted, his eye still pressed to the hole. "Maybe more in the trees." He fired, the rifle's report a deafening explosion inside the cabin. He worked the lever action, chambering another round with a smooth, practiced motion. "They're using the rocks for cover." Anwe pressed herself against the cold stones of the fireplace, making herself as small as possible. She could hear the men shouting outside, their voices muffled by the thick log walls. Bullets thudded into the cabin, embedding themselves in the timber with sickening thwacks. This was her fault. She had brought this violence to his door, to this place of peace he had built with his own hands. Guilt was a sharp, bitter taste in her mouth. Finn fired again. He moved between the peepholes on two different walls, never giving them a stationary target. He was a force of nature, a cornered bear defending its den. Anwe watched him, her fear mingling with a dawning sense of awe. He moved with a brutal grace, his every action deliberate and deadly. He was not just a quiet man of the mountains. He was a warrior. She saw a second rifle, smaller than his, leaning against the wall near the shelves. Without thinking, she crawled toward it. She knew guns. Her father had made sure of that. "A woman alone needs to know," he had said. She picked it up, the weight familiar in her hands. She checked the load. It was ready. Finn glanced at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "What are you doing?" "Helping," she said, her voice firm. She crawled to the opposite wall, to a peephole he wasn't using. She pressed her eye to it, the world shrinking to a tiny circle of gray pre-dawn light. She saw a flicker of movement behind a large boulder. She steadied the rifle, took a deep breath, and waited. The man broke cover, making a run for the blind spot near the porch. Anwe fired. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The man cried out and stumbled, clutching his leg before dragging himself back behind the rock. Finn stared at her, a look of stunned respect on his face. The quiet, helpless girl was gone. In her place was a survivor. The fight raged for another hour. They were pinned down, the four walls of the cabin their only salvation. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Finn moved like a ghost, a blur of deadly efficiency. He was bleeding from a shallow graze on his cheek, but he seemed not to notice. Anwe stayed at her post, firing sparingly, only when she had a clear shot. Her contribution was small, but it was enough to keep the attackers wary, forcing them to divide their attention. They had underestimated the man in the cabin, and they had not counted on her at all. A lull fell over the valley. The shooting stopped. The silence was more menacing than the gunfire. "They're planning something," Finn muttered, his voice low and tense. He reloaded his rifle, his hands moving with swift precision. It was in that moment of quiet that it happened. A high-powered bullet, fired from a greater distance, tore through the log wall right beside him. It missed his body, but a large, jagged shard of wood, blown inward by the impact, flew like a projectile and struck him high on the left arm. He grunted in pain, stumbling back, the rifle clattering to the floor. "Finn!" Anwe scrambled to his side. A dark, ugly gash was torn in his buckskin shirt, and blood was already soaking through, a shocking, vibrant red. He pressed a hand to the wound, his face pale beneath his beard, his jaw tight with pain. "It's nothing," he bit out, but she could see the tremor in his hand. Ignoring his protest, she ripped a long, clean strip from the hem of her cotton petticoat. Her hands were steady, her movements sure. She pushed his hand away gently and began to wrap the makeshift bandage tightly around his bicep, creating a pressure dressing to slow the bleeding. He watched her, his breathing harsh. Her face was inches from his, her expression one of fierce concentration. In the midst of the smoke and the threat of death, there was only this: her small, capable hands tending to his wound. The raw intimacy of the act was a shock to them both. He reached up with his good hand, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "Anwe," he said, his voice rough with pain and something else, something she couldn't name. "You're not a stranger," he rasped, his eyes holding hers. "Not anymore." A fresh volley of gunfire erupted from outside, shattering the moment. But the bond had been forged. Trust, paid for in blood and gunpowder, had taken root in the heart of the siege. The attackers had grown desperate. Shouts from outside confirmed Finn's grim suspicion. "Burn 'em out!" The smell of smoke began to snake through the cracks in the walls. They were throwing pitch-soaked torches against the cabin. Anway could hear the hungry crackle as the dry logs of the porch began to catch fire. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. They were trapped. The walls that had protected them were about to become their tomb. Finn, leaning heavily against the wall, his face slick with sweat, pushed himself upright. "The well," he said, his voice strained. "The back window opens over the well house roof. We can't stay here." The smoke was getting thicker, stinging their eyes, catching in their throats. Heat radiated from the front of the cabin. It was now or never. He moved to the small window at the back, his wounded arm held stiffly at his side. He unbarred it and pushed it open. Cool, clean air rushed in, a brief reprieve. Below them was the sloping roof of the small structure that covered the well. Beyond that, a stand of thick pine trees offered a chance of cover. "Go," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'll be right behind you." Anway hesitated, looking at his pale face, the dark stain spreading on his sleeve. "I'm not leaving you." "Go," he repeated, his tone fierce. "I can't cover you from in here." She understood. It wasn't about abandoning him. It was tactics, survival. She slung the smaller rifle over her shoulder, took a deep breath of the choking air, and scrambled through the window. She landed with a soft thud on the shingles of the well house roof, sliding down the short incline and dropping to the damp earth below. The air outside was cold and sharp. The front of the cabin was engulfed in orange flames. She could see two of the men, their faces illuminated by the fire, feeding the blaze. Finn appeared in the window, his large frame filling the opening. He lowered himself out, landing more heavily than she had, a gasp of pain escaping his lips as his wounded arm jarred. He rolled to his feet, his rifle in his good hand. "To the trees!" he hissed. They ran. A shout went up from the front of the house as they were spotted. The world erupted into chaos. Gunshots chased them as they sprinted across the open ground. A bullet whizzed past Anway's ear with a sound like a tearing cloth. She didn't look back. She ran for the safety of the deep woods, Finn a half step behind her, a grim, protective shadow. They plunged into the darkness of the forest just as the cabin's roof caught fire with a roar, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. The home he had built was burning, but they were alive, and they were together.